Well, shalom, everyone. Rabbi Mark Greenberg from the Tree of Life Bible Society here. Thank you for joining us for another TLV Talk. Joseph.
Yes, thank you for joining us. We are starting another TLV Talk with the book of Exodus.
That's right.
And Torah portion Shemot. We're very excited because it is a story that we are all very familiar with.
Yes. This is the story that when we first became believers and had our first Passover Seder at our house as believers, that we were watching the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, and while he's in the mud pits, Danya was making the haroseth, this symbolic cement and mud for making bricks, and she's walking in the whole mishmash, and the grape juice is going all over with, and she's crying, yes, that's your done. Anyway, that's what this is all about.
Yeah, and it's strange that, we talk about this story when it's not Passover.
Yes.
With the Torah portions the way they are, Passover, it's in April generally,
correct.
Give or take
That's
a month.
Right.
And, the fact is that, we're talking about this in the start of the new year this
right.
year.
And,
so it's interesting.
Well, that's because we still have the ramifications of this split of the calendar in the Jewish year between the religious calendar and the biblical calendar. The calendar that the sages have set up versus the calendar that God said, which is at Passover, which is the first of the month.
Right.
And so
I always found it strange. You know what I mean? Because we have our attention on this right now, but it's not actually the biblically mandated time in which God told us to remember.
That's right. And so that creeps in every once in a while, and this is one of them. So here we are in the beginning chapter, Shemot, which means names. Here it's Exodus chapter 1, going through chapter 6, verse 1. And
it leaves off right where we were with Joseph, right? Talking about that a Pharaoh rose up that didn't know what Joseph had done for Egypt and the surrounding region.
That's exactly
and so, I think that's interesting because, when people don't know about the miracles of God in a situation, they just, they forego what is expected. You know what I mean? The fact is that Joseph was able to help the entire region be sustainable.
He actually, he sustained not just the region, but at that point it was the world. Egypt was the center of the earth at those days. So not only did
civilization, at least.
Not only did a Pharaoh arise, but we also have the dynamic that the children of Israel, my forefathers, were, how do I say this kindly, multiplying prolifically.
Yes. And it goes from Joseph and his father Jacob and their brothers and their immediate families to, we find out in the first chapter that Israel has really become a nation. It's a different era.
It's a different era. You go from 70 of Israel that goes to Goshen to thousands and tens of thousands.
So much so that Pharaoh feels threatened by it.
Exactly right. And that's where all the enslavement happened. And enslavement comes out of fear. And Pharaoh was fearful.
And the thing is that this is not something that we didn't know about because it's forementioned to Abraham.
Correct.
While he's getting the covenant from God that they're going to be enslaved for 400 years. So it was on the books, but it happened.
Yes, and what's really important is that God is the one, the God of Israel he fulfills his word, even to himself.
Yeah, and that whole idea of there being a future and a hope. God doesn't do things without a reason. And we learned that from the last Torah portions back in Genesis, that it's all about what God did using Joseph. So he's doing this enslavement for a reason.
Exactly. And we have Moses growing up and becoming part of Pharaoh's household and all the things that happened to him along the way, from killing the Egyptian taskmaster to
being married to Zipporah and having his father in Midian. I mean, this Torah portion is only about 5 chapters long, but it's an enormous amount of time.
Correct.
You're going from literally before Moses is born to he's an adult, married, and God is actually speaking to him at the burning bush.
And he has his own son, and so he's spending years now as a shepherd until the day that he sees the burning bush, as you mentioned. And then God reveals himself. Now, there's a type and a shadow here that we need to be able to discuss just a little bit, and that is the way that God reveals himself to his creation. He reveals himself to us as human beings.
Yeah, it's a different era, not only in the people of Israel becoming a nation, but it's a different era in how God talks to people.
Well, in this case, God literally talked to Moses.
Right.
And now that we're in new covenant space, the difference is story time, if I may. I remember the first time that I sat down with my mother and father, along with Danya, and said, we're believers, and that God spoke to me. And I kid you not, the response was from my father, so, this is very Jewish, Marion, you hear the boy? God's talking to him now. My father was from the Bronx. Sorry, that's not a true Bronx accent. But
clearly not.
Clearly not. But having God talk to you, unfortunately, is almost considered, now you're hearing voices.
Yeah.
And the voice of God is not like any other voice. You know it's true.
And what's interesting is in this situation, we have Moses actually being given the name that God calls himself. We see for the first time God's name show up.
I am that I am.
Yeah, it's really quite interesting because Moses understands the fact that Pharaoh is only going to respond if he knows what God is this, right? So if he's going to make this, plea to Pharaoh, he needs to have a name. So we get to learn more about who God is in this Torah portion.
And the same thing happens with the elders and the children of Israel. Because when you're enslaved that way, when you're held captive, your hope is diminished. And so, well, Moses, you're one man. How are you going to do all this? And so there needed to be a name that he could tell them, and a demonstration of God's power on top of that, to show that God was with him in power and deed. So he had a tough sell.
And also, Moses
too.
is the first person that we see as, the main person that we're hearing about in the story that isn't necessarily a son or daughter of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? He's correct. A distant relative, but this is years and years and years in the past, so we're past the immediate family.
But he's a member and descent of the God of the Hebrews.
Yeah, and he's a Levite at that.
You bet? Okay, well, you got a chicken wing on that, or 2 or 10. So with that being said, we have all of this, that the way that God reveals himself. You know, sometimes he just speaks to you, sometimes he demonstrates his power, and sometimes you just know that God's leading you to a place that you did not think of yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. It's true. You know, Moses had a life that he was destined for, and God really reached him. And what's interesting is that yes, he ends up murdering a Egyptian, but it's out of righteous indignation.
Oh, of course,
of mistreatment. But what's interesting is, how do we respond to when things are done wrongly? Do we respond with the same level of angst and violence, or do we respond in a way that's actually constructive? And you see both of those happening with Moses, right?
Exactly.
You see, of his own human flesh, he ends up being violent.
And pays the consequence.
Yeah.
Because of a couple of, I'll just use Hebrews, a couple of my people, and we're arguing amongst themselves, and he comes along to them, say, "Why are you arguing? You know how you don't have time. You know, Pharaoh is enslaving you." And they come, "Well, who made you taskmaster? over us. Paraphrasing. After all, you already killed an Egyptian taskmaster, so the word was out, and he ran.
Yeah.
That's
and
the result.
The interesting thing is that Moses ends up being able to, actually be constructive after that through God's plan.
Oh,
right?
Exactly.
He understands in the moment, in the heat of the moment, he was violent and did the wrong thing. But God was able to take that, just like he took Joseph's life, right? He was able to take Moses' life and say, you know what? I'm going to use you to free your people.
Exactly. And he's going to use you as well. So stay on track. Keep your head straight.
Yeah, and be like Moses. In chapter 3, verse 4, it says, when Adonai saw that he turned to look, he called out to him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. So he answered, Hineni, here I am. And a lot of the time, that's all we have to do. And God can do the rest.
And to be truthful as human beings, sometimes that's all we can do. Because that's our limitation on our understanding.
Amen.
So, listen, we could go on and on again about the Word of God, but God bless you. Please go worship God this weekend in your local synagogue or church and give some praise to the God of Israel. Thank you for joining with us today.